Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm your host, Aaron Schellenberger. Today we're honored to have a special guest, Sir Anthony Buzzard. Anthony's work was tremendously instrumental in my becoming a biblical Unitarian. Incidentally, it was his debate with Trinitarian apologist Dr. James White that made me seriously rethink my view on the Trinity and the deity of Jesus. For many of us, Anthony is arguably the most influential biblical Unitarian in the past 2 decades. Today, he is going to share his perspective on what is commonly called the prologue of the Gospel of John, found in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Mr. Buzzard was born in Surrey, England, educated at Oxford University and Bethany Theological Seminary. He earned his Master of Arts in Theology and Modern Languages, served as co-editor of Journal from the Radical Reformation, and is currently the editor of a free monthly magazine titled Focus on the Kingdom. Anthony is married to a lovely wife, Barbara, and lives in Fayetteville, Georgia. And Anthony authored a number of books available on Amazon. So when you type his name, you will see some 12 books that he authored and or co-authored. Welcome aboard, Anthony.
Thank you, Aaron, for that very generous and more than generous
Oh, you deserve it.
introduction. I'm terrified to have affected you in that way. I just hope this is right because I'm responsible in part for you. So that's very sweet.
Yes, yes. Thank you
Uh,
so much. And
Yeah,
thank you for coming to my channel.
not at all.
So to start with, I have a number of preliminary questions
Yes,
for
sir.
you, Anthony.
Yes.
Why do you believe the topic of the prologue is important?
That's a great question. It is. It is the question because John 1:1 has
Sure.
affected theology more,
Right.
I suppose, than any other verse by far. It's just huge.
Sure.
And we need to try to get this one right as best we can. So that's my answer to that one.
Okay. So explain to us your understanding of the prologue.
Yeah, with great interest. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Okay.
I start by saying that the word "word," either the Greek or the Hebrew, wouldn't matter, is never, ever, ever, ever a person. So it would be a huge mistake to say in the beginning was Jesus or in the beginning was the second member of the Trinity. So when I hear somebody saying in the beginning was Jesus, I'm thinking, oh, we're going back into Trinity. So that's the fundamental error that lies at the basis of my thinking here. If you can show that logos in the New Testament or davar, equivalent words in the Old Testament, means a person, then we've got something to start. But otherwise, we don't get off the ground.
Now, what do you think of the so-called Socinian view? Basically, the word or logos in Greek
Yes,
as the man Jesus himself.
that's exactly the question. It actually repeats your first question because Jesus is a person.
Okay.
And since the word logos never ever in either text, in either part of the Bible means a person, I have to say you're going to have to show it can happen. It can be an exception. It can. But that's a tremendous block for me.
Okay.
And so I want to begin by quoting a famous statement from the Qumran people, the people at Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, the Socinians had never heard of them, but at the Dead Sea Scrolls in the time of Jesus, you have this: by his knowledge, everything has been brought into being, and everything that is, God established by his purpose, and apart from God, nothing is done. That sounds awfully like John 1:1 to me. And so it's reasonable to say, well, that's what a Jew would understand by this. Again, unless we can show an example, I don't see the word logos ever meaning a person. You might
Okay.
argue for Revelation where Jesus returns and he's called the Word there, and that's what he is. He's what the Word became. But to say that in the beginning he was, there was a person called Jesus, that takes me back into Trinity. Whether you say that was, in the beginning of our 2,000 years ago, or whether it was original creation, it wouldn't matter. In both cases, that's a defilement, so to speak, of the word logos. So I'm
Okay.
insisting that it doesn't mean a person, it means a thought. And in John's gospel, let's add this now, never ever is John calling Jesus the Word.
The
The
word.
Word
Okay.
is always the gospel, it's always what Jesus said. It's the mind, the thinking, as we mean word, never capital W. So I think that's the basis of really my feeling here.
So do you take the prologue in
Yeah.
a chronological fashion, or do you take it topically, or if you will, eclectically, a combination of chronology here and there, and then topically here and there?
Well, I take it chronologically. If I read Enachi, which is in the beginning, I look and see what does Enachi mean. And
Okay.
Enachi, I would argue, never means anything in John's gospel except the obvious connection with Genesis, which everybody else takes.
Right.
That doesn't make them
Okay.
right. But the obvious connection of Enachi is a chronological one. Everybody, until the Socinians came along, said, obviously that's Genesis, where God said this and did this, said this. And so they said, well, that's the beginning. I would like
Okay.
to see that refuted for sure. You
Now, do
can
you
have,
take it
yeah, go ahead.
chronologically all the way through verse 1 and then verse 2, and then because in verse 6, John the Baptist
Yes,
is injected, and then in 14 it says the word became flesh.
exactly.
All of that, you're saying that those are in that chronological order.
Well, I am, because John the Baptist always precedes Jesus. That's a very important point.
Okay.
It's never the other way around. That would be cart before the horse. In all the
Okay.
Gospels, John comes in front of Jesus first.
Okay.
So, absolutely. And I'll add this grammatical point that might be a little technical,
Okay.
that John makes it clear in verse 5, actually. He's talking about the light. And
Okay.
he makes it neuter, as we would expect, the light.
Okay.
But in verse 10, this is linguists love this stuff. He makes a hugely important point. In verse 10, the light has suddenly become afton in Greek, which is masculine. He's
Okay.
broken the rules of grammar deliberately to say, now in my chronological story, that light has become a human being in verse 6, but not before.
So, yeah, we'll get back to that,
Yes,
Anthony.
sir. Yes.
Do you think there are sections in the prologue? Do you believe that we can divide the prologue into maybe two or three sections? So, what sections would you take them as?
My point is that we're looking at the meaning of words, and we're saying is, what does logos mean? And when I
Okay.
don't find anywhere in the whole of Scripture the word logos to mean a person, then I mean, it can still be right. But I used to say to the students, if you've come up with something that no commentator in any language for 2,000 years ever imagined, then you've got to be cautious. That's all. And I'm simply saying that whatever this is, it's about the logos, right? In the beginning was the logos. If that's a person, this would be the only time that ever, I think, means a person.
Now, do you think that there is an element of personification in the
Yes,
prologue? Okay.
absolutely. No question. The
Okay.
obvious connection with Qumran is it's about wisdom. Every Jew would hear this as in the beginning was wisdom,
Okay.
which is not a person, it's a personification. So, absolutely, I think it's
Yeah. How
personification.
would you respond to
Yeah.
somebody saying that it doesn't say in the beginning was Sophia?
Only because it's obvious to a Jew at that time
Okay.
from Qumran, purpose, wisdom, word, they're all saying by his knowledge. I mean, that's the first approach to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about elements of wisdom Christology? Because you mentioned wisdom, right?
Yes,
So not
absolutely.
only is there a personification, but there's also wisdom there, wisdom Christology, I take.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Totally agreed with you. But wisdom is a personification and not a person.
So while the writer of the Gospel of John
Mm.
uses logos, not
Yes.
Sophia, you were suggesting that the writer somehow had this I guess, assumption that the Logos somehow is a reference to wisdom. How do we establish that
Yes.
the Gospel of John was written with the idea of wisdom, Sophia, being in place there?
Well, because we find in concurrent Jewish writings, not only at Qumran,
Okay.
we find that particularly wisdom came to dwell. That's
Okay.
very Jewish. Again, we're back to our base point. Since it isn't a person, what else it is? It's not a fly, it's not a beetle. So
Right.
there's no other option. But I think you're absolutely right to suggest that Logos and Sophia are the same idea. So in the beginning was Moses makes absolutely no sense. If I may add one point here, Aaron,
Sure.
Moses is never, ever, ever said to be prostantheon, to be. No, to be prostantheon, never, ever. So nobody's going to think, well, he's talking about Moses. He's not, because Moses was never said to be, I stress be, prostantheon. Moses could pray to God, of course, he could
Okay.
ask God, but he's never said to be prostantheon. So you haven't got any connection to build your case on, I think, if you're taking that point of view. And I'm not trying to argue with you. You understand that. We're
Right, right.
examining
Well,
this.
yeah, you brought that up, and biblical Unitarian brother Bill Schlegel
Yes.
had put
Hmm.
out a
Yes.
podcast pertaining to the case you're bringing up, and
Yes.
let's get into the nitty gritty. Several areas of the prologue.
Hmm.
Now, reading John 1:1, in the
Yes.
beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What is the meaning of that word beginning in light of the prologue and the whole gospel? I know your
Yes.
interpretation is this beginning is a reference to the Genesis
Yes.
creation account.
Yes.
But in light of the prologue
Hmm.
and the whole gospel of John,
Hmm.
how does beginning here in this text
Yes.
relate to the prologue and the gospel of John? How
Yes.
would
Well,
you
the
answer
only
that?
way I can examine that is to look at that little phrase enachi. The only way that you and I have any way of doing Bible studies to say, let's compare word with word. You know, it's the Jewish method, the Gezar Shava, as they call it. You look at this word, you say, oh, I see, it's used here. So I look at enachi. Do I
Okay.
find enachi in that sense, just a phrase like enachi? Do I find that in John's gospel? No, nothing to
Now,
compare with. The only thing I have to compare with is the
is
Old
the
Testament
gospel, I mean, is the
enachi,
creation,
yeah,
yeah.
the creation. That's the only link that I'm able to make so far.
Now, how would you respond to the idea that beginning here somehow is a reference to the beginning of the ministry, or perhaps the beginning of the new creation?
Because it's the beginning. At the beginning here is logos. We're back to the word logos.
Okay.
And we have to say, what does logos mean? We're not talking about any beginning here. We're talking about in the beginning was the log. In fact, he repeats it, as you know. All things are made by this logos. Nothing came into being without the logos. He repeats himself, which again is very striking. He
Right.
says the same thing twice. That means that John is trying hard to get his point over. And I just don't find in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. I don't have any way to link that.
There are perhaps a few biblical Unitarians
Yes.
who may take a combination of your view, Socinian
Okay.
view, as follows. The Logos here, an impersonal entity, a
Okay.
concept. So the
Mhm.
Logos, yeah, is not the human Jesus himself. Somehow the beginning here still has to do with the beginning of the creation, new creation. And yes, by the time we get to verse 14, the Logos becomes Jesus.
I'm suggesting that, as in verse 14, the word came flesh, that word become is not the same as the word to be. See, these are rather
Right,
technical
right.
language things, and they're not the business of people who don't know a word about Greek. They're not ideally the people to do this. It
Okay.
doesn't make the other people infallible, but the word became flesh, you put it exactly right. The word became flesh for me means Jesus is what the word
The
became.
word became,
And
yeah.
if you say the water turned into wine, you're not going to say, well, that means the water was wine. That's just silly. So we're
Okay.
breaking all kinds of very easy laws, in my opinion.
Which verse in the prologue are we to take the Logos as a person?
That's John the Baptist in verse 8. He came to
Okay.
testify about that light. That light then turns out to be in verse 10 is really the
Okay.
key point, to be a him. And now that is actually very striking. For language people, it's very, very important because afto is neuter. And here John has broken, it's called an ad sensum agreement. And these are very important points, like the abomination of desolation is said to be a person. People don't know that in Mark 13,
Okay.
14. This is a very striking point. John is saying, now, wait a minute, here I'm talking about the light being a person. I'm breaking the rules of grammar to scream this at you. And so
Okay.
I too take verse 10 then to be the first.
If we move backward, the light in verse 7, John the Baptist came as a
Yes,
witness to
yes,
testify about the light.
yes.
The light there is the man Jesus.
It's made completely clear, I think, in verse 10.
The light in verse 7, is that the same light spoken in verse 4? It says, "In him was life, and
Yes.
the life was the light of mankind." So that light of mankind, is that the same Jesus?
We know the light shines in darkness. The darkness did not comprehend it. That's certainly a reference back to Genesis, but it becomes explicit, let's put it that
In
way,
verse
for
10.
me in verse 10.
We can still take in verse 14 that the word became flesh.
The word became flesh. What I object to there is to say the word was flesh. That's just language wise wrong.
Right.
Any more than saying that the water was wine. Come on, let's not do that. Egeneto means to change condition. In fact, we have from the Bauer lexicon a statement, genome, egeneto,
Right.
has to do with things changing
Yeah,
their
not in an
nature.
ontological fashion, but just, Jesus has become the embodiment of God's word,
This
right?
actually is well understood by most commentators. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, Anthony.
Mm.
I've been kind of playing with this theory. If you take verses 1, 2, 3, jump over to verse 14, perhaps verses 4 to 13 are parenthetical. Verses 1, 2,
Hmm.
3, the
Hmm.
logos was still or is still a concept. And then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13
Hmm.
talks about the works of the logos, in
Yes.
in Jesus. And then in verse 14, it summarizes what was discussed in verses 4 to 13.
What I absolutely, as a language person, and this doesn't make one in any way infallible, but we're all good at something. It so
Yeah, yeah.
happens that we did language at my private school from the age of 13. This is what was drummed into
Right,
us.
right.
And at Oxford, we did language and meaning words. This doesn't grant infallibility, but it does give
Sure,
you a little sense, as in your profession. I don't tell you how your profession works. And I
sure.
think that needs to be allowed. And I'm not buying the idea that those Socinians were necessarily good linguists. In fact, I think they
Okay.
were very rational, and their view has become new agey now. It's not the best. What I'm against is saying that in 1:1 the word
Yes.
should be capitalized. I think
Right,
that's,
right.
and as you
Yeah.
said at the beginning of our discussion,
Yeah,
this
if
is a
if you
huge issue.
capitalize the W there, and
Yes,
that
yes,
already biases or
yes.
biases for the idea that the logos is a person.
Well, that's Trinity. I mean, we started by this is the hugest thing by far.
Yeah.
And that's we could add this little thought here for our audience. In John 1, 1 John 1, the
Okay.
epistle, John is saying, I didn't say in the beginning was a he. I said it 5 times.
Okay,
Yes.
let's go to verse
Mm.
3.
Yes.
We read there, all things
Yes.
came into being through him, and apart from him,
Yes.
not even one thing came into being that
Yes.
has come into being.
Yes.
Now, that term, all things, what is
Hmm.
the author referring to when
Oh,
he used
I
that,
think the
that term?
creation. But
Is
you,
that
of
the
course, you
literal
yes.
creation of
Oh,
all things?
absolutely. But the hymn, you see, you gave us a hymn, whereas all English translations before the King James had it there, even in our own English translations. So the capital W on word is repeated as a colossal mistake in my understanding. In verse 3, all things came into being through it, the word, small w,
Okay.
and without it, nothing came to being that came into being.
Now, what do you think of the idea
Mm.
that all things here is not a reference to,
Yeah.
the material creation, but rather it's talking about the things, at least some of the
Yes.
things that happen in the Gospel of John. All things
Oh, I
came
see.
about.
Well, I don't
in the
have
person of
any.
Jesus?
Yeah, we'd have to look at the phrase "all things,"
Okay.
and of course, I don't find that meaning that in the Gospel of John.
Okay.
The normal meaning of all things panta is the creation, and
Got it.
again backed up by that Qumran statement, by his purpose, it, everything. By John's own insistence in First John, I didn't say in the beginning was he. I said in the beginning was it. So John is really correcting an incipient misunderstanding of
Yeah,
his
yeah.
gospel.
Now,
Yeah.
the term world, is that a reference to the physical creation?
Yeah, I would say so. The system, the world system, the universe, I would think so.
How is that even a reference to trees, animals, and human beings when verses 14, I'm sorry, 4 to 13, they're simply about the work of Jesus?
Yeah, again, the only way that you and I have to go is to say, what does cosmos mean in the New Testament? What does cosmos mean in John's Gospel? Just like
Okay.
we're saying, what does logos mean in John's Gospel? And we mustn't then leap into another field unless we've got evidence for it. So in John's Gospel, the world is certainly the evil world. I don't know
Okay.
that that's what John has in mind earlier. All things, the evil world was made by God. That makes no sense. So it's more like the system of things.
Okay.
Everything came from, I mean, God's whole point, it seems to me, in having a universe at all was because of what he intended to do in his son.
Now, I got one
Mm.
final question for
Yes,
you, Anthony.
yes.
In verse 14, it says, "And the word became flesh and
Hmm.
dwelt among us, and we saw
Absolutely.
his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and
Yes.
truth." The word became flesh. It's not ontological.
I don't know what you mean by ontological there. The word changed its nature and became something it wasn't before, just like the water became wine.
Your
Yes.
interpretation of became
Mm.
flesh
Mm.
is not ontological, right? Like God thought about Jesus and then he became flesh. That's what I
Well,
meant.
I
Ontological.
simply mean that the word, which was God's plan, God's
Okay.
purpose, God's
God's wisdom.
thinking, it then was expressed in a human being. So Jesus
Got
is
you.
a walking word. Jesus is wisdom. Paul says that. He talks about wisdom. Jews knew about wisdom being a person and dwelling in Israel. There are
Okay.
echoes of what Judaism believed here. But one of the echoes you won't find in Judaism is that the Messiah was literally a person before he was born. I'm
Okay.
bringing the general background here.
Yeah. So according to Paul,
Yes.
Jesus is wisdom. Now, why
Yes.
can't we say Jesus is the Word?
Once the word has become a human being, the word has
Right.
become flesh, which is, by the way, what you're supposed to believe not to be Antichrist, right? We're
Right.
dealing with a big
So just
issue
to be
here.
clear, in
Yeah.
verses 1, 2, and 3, at
Yes.
least,
Mm.
the word there is not Jesus, not yet at least.
Not
But in
yet.
14,
Oh, yes.
the word is Jesus because the
Absolutely.
word became flesh.
Yes.
Got it.
Jesus is, as actually Goppelt, a German theologian, says it's nice. Jesus, I'll quote him exactly, Jesus is what the word became,
Got it.
not one to one equal with the word.
It's not that Jesus is the word and the word is Jesus. There's
No, no,
no
no, no,
one-to-one
no. No,
correspondence.
no,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. If that's what you mean by ontological thing, I'm not sure
Right, right.
exactly what you meant by that, but he's what the that says it beautifully. Goppelt.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
before we close,
Yes,
Anthony,
indeed.
if you would give us a summary of, general overview.
My basic point then is the word person is not a translation of logos, ever.
Right.
Barring maybe you could say the one in Revelation, where the word comes back at the second coming. That's a
Yeah, yeah.
person,
I
that's
meant to
Jesus.
ask you about that
Yes,
too. I'm sorry to
I
cut
think
you
that's right.
off.
No,
In
that's right.
Revelation 19:13,
That's right.
it says his name is the word of God.
Yes,
That's after Jesus I'm sorry, that's
yes.
after the word became flesh.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay. Okay.
And actually, some Unitarians are afraid of that. They don't like it, so they try to get rid of it. I wouldn't. Eric Chang, I recommend that book,
Okay.
the Only True God. By the way, I mean he did a masterful study of this subject. For 50 years, he taught the Trinity professionally,
Mm.
and then he changed his mind. That is a remarkable book, The Only True God by Eric Chang. And he's a little bit hesitant. I'm not. I think that's plainly Jesus, and he is God's full expression. He's what the word became. By that stage,
Okay.
I'll accept that entirely. I don't want to be defensive. So
Got
that's the
you.
first point. Word never means so. In the beginning was Jesus. It's just fundamentally impossible.
Okay.
It doesn't work. The second point is, it never says that Moses was with God. It does say that Moses spoke to God, prayed to God, that's fine, but that's not the phrase in, was, proston theon. So it's a false line of reasoning for me to make a comparison with Moses here, unless you can show that Moses was said to be, underlined, proston theon. He's not. He prays to God, that's a different thing. So we've got to be precise with our language comparisons there.
So, Anthony, I very much appreciate your time, sir, and
Likewise.
hoping and praying that God would continue to bless your ministry.
Thank you so much, Aaron. God bless you, sir.
God bless you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.